everyone, and welcome back to People Jew Wanna Know podcast. I'm excited for you to hear today's episode because it honestly turned out to be a masterclass on Middle Eastern history and the current foreign policy climate within the Arab world. This is an area I'm not particularly well versed in, so I learned a ton, and I hope you will as well. Today's guest is Chama Mechtaly, who was actually nominated by former podcast guest and IDF soldier Noy Leib. Chama is the founder of the Emma Lazarus Institute for Liberty and Tolerance, a post-October 7th action tank focusing on bridging media and policy gaps between the Middle East and the democratic West. Chama is a sought-after speaker, facilitator, activist, and entrepreneur whose work has been featured across global media outlets and podcasts. She is also a social media activist running a viral account at Millennial More. And Chama is a visual artist who has exhibited her paintings in 4 continents, including twice at the Jerusalem Biennale. She's currently based in New York after spending 7 years in Dubai. Born into a Muslim-Jewish family in Morocco, Chama is deeply rooted in the values of faith-based dialogue, reconciliation, and positive transformation between Muslims and Jews, as well as Eastern and Western values. Since the advent of the Abraham Accords, Chama has advised numerous governmental and non-governmental organizations on the Israeli-Arab cooperation, de-radicalization, and cultural diplomacy. She is a recipient of the Middle East Policy Council 40 Under 40 Award, a fellow at Atlantic Council, a convener at Israel Policy Forum, and a Schusterman Foundation ROIer. As I have said many times on this podcast, diversity is really important to me. Diversity of background, experiences, and most importantly, diversity of thought. Chama is our first Muslim-Jewish guest, and ever since I met her, I have just been incredibly impressed with her. She's clearly an expert on the Middle East, and she has a very clear talk track around where she stands on certain issues. So it's a huge privilege to learn from her. Chama and I come from literally the most polar opposite backgrounds. She's this tall, gorgeous, dark-haired Moroccan woman, and I am a short, blonde girl from Ukraine. And yet, Chama and I have the same opinion on so many different issues. So when I spoke to her, I told her we're like a black and white cookie together. We're 2 different sides of the same coin, whatever metaphor you want to use. It's just funny to me how much we have in common, even though we are very different. I actually ended up meeting Chama in person at a Chabad Sukkot 3000 event. This is an event where 3,000 young Jewish professionals celebrate Sukkot together in a massive sukkah. And for how serious and professional Chama may sound on this podcast, considering we're talking about very serious topics here, I have to tell you, she is so funny and lighthearted in person. She has an amazing sense of humor and just a radiant smile, and I had such a fun time getting to know her at that event. In this episode, you will hear Chama break down the current political climate between what she calls the democratic West and the Middle East. And she'll also walk us through some common misunderstandings about foreign policy that lead to our inability to make progress with the Arab world. She addresses the current Israel-Hamas war, where she thinks it's headed, and her stance on one-state versus two-state solution. Chama and I recorded this episode right around the time of the attack on the Israeli people in Amsterdam. It's obviously a very challenging time for Jewish people all over the world, and Chama isn't shy to call out radical extremism we see today. I thought she offered very refreshing takes on this episode on all the issues I mentioned to you, so please enjoy. Hello, Chama. Welcome to People Jew Wanna Know podcast. How are you today?
Thank you so much for having me. I am doing well. It's been a very difficult culminating with the attacks in Amsterdam and Sweden, so very much reeling from that, but it took the weekend to come back to self, so I'm feeling okay.
Yeah, you and I met a couple of weeks ago to talk about doing this podcast together, and I feel like the climate in the Arab world was completely different from what it is just a few weeks later, even with the election of Trump and Qatar's messaging around Hamas. So I'm really excited to pick your brain, and without further ado, tell us about yourself. What do you do, and how did you get there?
Sure. My name is Chama Mechtaly. I like to kind of summarize what I do in this mission, where I have felt rooted since I was a child. And this mission is to bring Israel and the Arab world closer and to solve for a more sustainable peace building and more sustainable regional integration in the Middle East, and to bring the Middle East and the democratic West closer. And so I do that through multiple sort of avenues, and I have done so in multiple ways since I was a teenager. But right now, I run an action tank that I founded called the Lazarus Institute for Liberty and Tolerance, where we really focus on that mission and with an angle of countering extremism, specifically since the explosion of extremism after October 7th has really shown up in all of our most sacred spaces and institutions. I also have had a history of working as an artist and cultural entrepreneur, really using my own work, my own paintings, my own creativity and sort of entrepreneurial endeavors as a way to bring Muslims and Jews closer, to build sustainable bridges between both communities and humanize specifically Jews in the eyes of Muslims, and really advocate for the representation of Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews in the West. And that work also culminated in creating a small business out of the UAE after I moved there in 2016, which is called Moors and Saints, where we create collections inspired by different sacred spaces all over the world that carry this legacy of Moorish design and architecture. And we use those jewelry pieces and products and stories to allow people to see the impact of the Jewish community all over the world, but specifically in the Muslim world, and kind of use these Jewish Muslim syncretism stories to create a foundation for better dialogue and conflict transformation. And after the Abraham Accords, since I was in the UAE, I jumped into policy work. And I ended up doing a lot of projects for different governmental and non-governmental organizations to really bring Israel and the UAE and Bahrain and Morocco closer.
That's amazing. And there's a part that I want to include in your bio, which is you are also an online activist. Mind you,
Sure.
Miss Viral on Instagram, which you casually omitted. And you come from a Muslim Jewish family and a Muslim Jewish home. So talk to me about growing up in a home that's Muslim and Jewish.
Sure. So I grew up in Morocco until I was 17 years old in Casablanca. My mother's from Tangier, comes from a Muslim spiritual, traditional background. And my father comes from the south of Morocco originally. Family is from Essaouira, which used to host the biggest Jewish community in Morocco. And my grandfather ended up moving to Casablanca and starting a family there. And it's really interesting because once he moved to Casablanca, he had to get a new national ID, and the French butchered his last name. The French were ruling Morocco at the time. And so instead of Mechtaly, they ended up adding a T, kind of further disconnecting us from the community, from his sort of Jewish story, his Jewish history and tradition. And so my father was born in 1948, out of all years, and was born in a mostly Jewish neighborhood in Casablanca, which was also really famous for anti-colonial activism against the French, extremely loyal to the monarchy, and really believed in this kind of Moroccan exception, which is a message that kind of continues, and really fought for this post-colonial Moroccan modern society in which Jews and Muslims could coexist, and the same way that he had lived those realities as a little kid. It's ironic, he grew up with this sort of anti-colonial French sentiment, but also deeply shaped by French education, extremely secular, pushing for secularism and this idea that religion should not have any space in state building. And after 1967, there was obviously a lot of trauma that the Jewish community navigated. And I think that slowly my father started to really fear for kind of sharing his story and telling people about the background he comes from. And he is not an exception. There are many Jews in Morocco who have had to forcibly convert, who carry extremely Jewish last names like Gohain, and who today identify as Muslim. And in fact, because they have these sort of visibly Jewish names, are forced to denounce the rest of the Jewish community and to call out Israel's actions and condemn the Israeli government, etc. So I think my father grew up with a lot of that trauma, and he ended up really just falling in love with my mother and getting married because my paternal grandmother made the shidduch, essentially met her in the beach, and that's what happened. But growing up in that environment meant that I had a lot of space at home to flesh out these religious questions. But every time I stepped outside of the household, I was met with a lot of religious extremism. And mind you, I was born in 1992. Growing up in the late 90s, early 2000s, there was a wave of Islamist insurgency that we felt all around. There were terrorist attacks in the early 2000s, culminating in a significant terrorist attack on the 16th of May 2006. And that targeted the Jewish community of Casablanca. It also targeted the sort of more secular, more liberal fractions of this capital city. So a lot of the intellectuals, a lot of the socialists, a lot of the liberal democratic people and organizations and spaces where journalists and dissidents would meet, and targeted the center of sort of Jewish life in Casablanca, as well as this Spanish restaurant and a hotel. So that meant that as a young child, I saw body pieces, like organs, scattered on the ground. It's really interesting because growing up in that environment, no one takes you to therapy. No one really even understands the importance of sort of trauma and therapy, etc. But I will never forget those images. It really stuck with me, that feeling of lack of safety and that feeling of utter shock and betrayal and disbelief, alienation, and really just not recognizing the environment in which you grew up all of a sudden. While growing up in Morocco, I experienced many different instances of how that religious extremism started to manifest itself. And one story that is extremely vivid in my memory is while coming back from class in 6th grade with two of my friends. And again, we're all in 6th grade, so extremely young girls wearing dresses. And this man who is broad, big, bearded guy, clearly signifying that he's a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, he came launching at us, and he picked me up and picked up both of my friends at the same time. And me and my friend who were in the edges fought back and were able to release ourselves. But the friend who was in the center was picked up and smashed down to the ground multiple times. And it was extremely scarring for me. And I started understanding that as a woman, first of all, my experiences in the public space are extremely limited and repressed. And as a woman of mixed identities who very viscerally understood that I have this Jewish heritage, but I didn't fully understand at the time because I was a child how that made me different or made me more of a target. So these are all things I had to work through with time. But all I knew was that there was a systemic attack against both women and indigenous people. So in middle school, I became an activist for the rights of the Amazigh indigenous community of North Africa. And as part of that, I was pushing the conversation and the agenda for the recognition of Jewish indigenous rights within Morocco. And so that will launch a lot of my career, and like articles were written about my work when I was in high school.
Wow, I had no idea that happened to you because you and I, when we chatted, it didn't come up. But I imagine with what we saw in Amsterdam, it's a very jarring experience because it resembles in some sense what you've experienced before, decades prior. So it's really a shame that although we're in a different place, we're still kind of in the same place all along, aren't we?
Absolutely. And what happened in Amsterdam also re-triggers what happened on October 7th. The execution, the style of intimidation, harassment, bullying. It's a pattern that did not start on October 7th. People love to talk about the context. We have receipts, we have context that goes back for at least 2,000 years. And especially things that I personally carry have started in the 7th century with sort of the imperial colonization of much of what we see today as the Arab world, and was crystallized further with 1492 and the Catholics kicking out both Jews and Muslims. And so that's really part of why I wanted to launch the Emma Lazarus Institute for Liberty and Tolerance and name it after Emma Lazarus, who is a Sephardi Jewish poetess and social reformist who fought for everyone's rights, who fought for immigration, who defined the ideals of America, the ideals of what this nation is supposed to be, supposed to mean, and ended up being canceled for her Zionism because as pogroms were taking place in Russia and she started speaking in defense of her people, of her community, of the most oppressed people seeking refuge and seeking safety coming to America, she was completely canceled and dismissed for her Zionist writings and speeches. And part of what really triggers me as a woman carrying these legacies is the erasure and invisibility of these women, in particular, of Jewish women. And Emma Lazarus ended up defining and really shaping the foundation of modern Zionism 10 years before Herzl said anything about Zionism. It was also intentional in the sense that I'm always trying to bring back the legacy and the memory of Jewish women who are at this intersection of multiple forms of abuse and oppression and erasure. And I felt that as a kid. And so it was always central to my work, and it will continue to be.
Yeah, and I think above all else, we have to give credit where credit is due, right? So that's something that you're able to do through your work. And I'm curious about something that I consider to be your bread and butter. So one of the opinions I have, which maybe you'll disagree with me or agree with me, we'll find out shortly, is that I think people in the Western world fundamentally don't understand the value structure and the societal structure of the Middle East. And they often impose Western ideals of democracy, for example, thinking that's the aspiration of people in the Middle East, where it may very well not be. So we're like prescribing what we think we know about the Middle East or what we think they want in the Middle East, when that, in fact, is not necessarily even true. And it's an infantilization of a people because it implies that I know better than you about what you want. And I think that's a huge reason why we sometimes misunderstand each other and have bad foreign policy between the West and the Middle East, is because the Western man wants to explain to the Arab what to do, like in overly simplistic terms. And that's not right. You can't take away dignity from a people or from a world power. And I wanted to see what those differences are that you would say on a political level or on a foreign policy level, and how we can start to normalize our relationship between the West and the Middle East.
Absolutely. So I agree with you. That is a prevalent, what I call a disease or a pathology in the specifically political elite, and in particular, the democratic elite of the Western world, who obviously sees the virtues of democracy, which can never be dismissed. I'm a big champion of democracy and democratic values. However, what they miss, and this is the tragedy, is that specifically after 1979, the Islamic Revolution, in which the Islamic Republic kind of set a new tone for what democracy could look like in the Middle East, and was welcomed and championed by democratic allies in the West, unfortunately, who failed to see the inherent authoritarian, theocratic nature of the Islamic Republic. But this was solidified even further through the Arab Spring, because the Islamic Republic essentially brought this narrative that a Shiite Islamic establishment could bring democratic values to West Asia. Now, the Arab Spring created the narrative that a Sunni Islamic series of organizations, obviously championed by the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, but that they could take the region towards a democratic transition. And that is obviously a lie. That is obviously that's their strategy to become digestible to Western audiences. And they were extremely strategic in defining not only that tone and creating a whole PR campaign, especially through social media, at the beginning of the Arab Spring and following the Arab Spring. But their power really lies in the fact that they packaged this democratic story to Western allies, specifically in democratic parties, and told them that they were the only hope for a people who have been ruled by monarchies in particular, also by decades of corrupt, non-monarchy affiliated, but corrupt leaders, right? Especially in the cases of Tunisia, of Libya, of Egypt. And these were all kind of the legacy of the Pan-Arabist movement, which was in itself anti-monarchies. And so after decades of the Arab world trying to give them a chance to prove themselves and feeling like nothing was improving, that created an environment for the Muslim Brotherhood's affiliates and leaders to really go in and manipulate the populace, manipulate the 99% of the population into thinking that they were the only hope. And you can't blame them, because when things have been stagnating for decades and people can't put food on the table, you can only expect that they would want an alternative in governance. And we're seeing this in the United States today, not to equate the forms of government whatsoever, but just to say that it might not seem like a natural fit or that it would make sense, but people vote and people riot and protest when their needs are not heard, when they don't feel seen and understood. And so the brilliance of the Muslim Brotherhood and the Islamic Republic was in creating, packaging the story about what they call a new dawn for democracy in the Middle East and North Africa, and to sell that narrative in DC in particular. And there is an organization called the Dawn for Democracy in the region, which was co-founded by the journalist who was killed in Turkey, Khashoggi, who was part of the Washington Post. And that is also another perhaps controversial topic that I would be happy to get into. But basically, there was this culmination of these movements, of these protests, of the Arab Spring, of the Islamic Revolution, led to this holy sacred alliance that we have been seeing, which is the alliance or the marriage of the Islamists and the kind of extreme leftists, or otherwise known as the Red-Green Alliance. This has been building for decades, and we have to wake up and realize that not only does it not benefit the West, but it also just extremely hurts the East. And that's why we can't be naive about what democracy means or should mean for the Middle East. And we also have to be pragmatic and realistic and consolidate the allyships that the West and that the United States has with allies in the Middle East who have been acting as allies for decades and who really look to the United States to define a certain language, a certain agenda, and to see their needs instead of work against them. The West in particular needs to realize that the Abraham Accords were born out of that struggle between the Islamists who want to topple governments and existing governments and monarchies who do have a more moderate, more sort of peaceful, stable, prosperous agenda for the region, and who have been fighting this extremism that we are seeing a lot more of today, and have been just feeling like that is completely lost on the West. And we can bring up the example of Saudi's war on the Houthis in Yemen and how completely lost in translation that whole situation was. And it's very similar to what Israel is navigating today, and Israel turning into pariah state and being abandoned by the voices for democracy. And so that's critical to understand, because if you don't understand this fight between Islamists and moderates in the Middle East, we cannot understand the Abraham Accords, right? And we can't understand the region. Now, the Abraham Accords came to be signed in September of 2020 after a decade of these moderate governments and monarchies really trying to do as much as they can to de-radicalize society and to effectively dismantle these Muslim Brotherhood and Islamic Republic affiliated organizations that have been steering the pot and causing chaos and turmoil so that they can move in a more formal way and take over different nation states, as we have seen happen in Egypt, in Tunisia, in Libya. And we saw the start of it in Syria until Bashar al-Assad waged full war against his own people to stay in power because he partnered with the Islamists. He partnered with Hezbollah to contain the protest movement. So these are the things that people in the West have been completely blinded on, and not realizing that the Abraham Accords weren't just some kind of Trump scheme or some kind of beautification project for the Trump administration to make them win points for re-election. It was an agenda that was pursued by the moderates in the Arab world for more than a decade. And they could not find the right allies in the Democratic Party to push it forward. And that narrative that the Abraham Accords were just shoved down the throats of moderates in the Arab world is precisely what you named, Margarita, which is that it strips the Arab world of its agency. It infantilizes the systems of governance of the region. It reduces them to people who don't really understand their own countries and their own policies and their own people and their own cultures, which is outrageous. Part of why the Abraham Accords have been successful, you can say up until October 7th, but even post October 7th, because we have seen Saudi Arabia and Jordan partnering up to stop missiles from Iran, for example. So the success still stands militarily and otherwise. But part of why they have been so successful is that there was a need, really also from the bottom up, to move in a different direction, because there was a realization that these Islamist organizations only wanted destruction and chaos and turmoil, and used the people of the Arab world as pawns in this bigger geopolitical, hegemonic, ambitious Iranian plan. And so it's time that the West wakes up to these things. But also, I fear that the West is waking up to the threats of the Islamic Republic and how it has been defining and maneuvering a lot of this turmoil. But I'm afraid they are missing another head of the snake, because the snake actually has two heads, not just one. One head is in Iran, in the RGC, in the Islamic Republic, but the other head is in the Muslim Brotherhood. And the Muslim Brotherhood, while it started in Egypt, has been pretty much adopted by the Qataris, by Qatar, since the late 90s, and really solidified and equipped with so many resources. We're talking billions of dollars, not just resources that are deployed to Islamize and turn the face of the Middle East into an Islamist Middle East, from what we call al-Mashriq to al-Maghrib, so the Levant to Morocco. But they have been supporting this rise of the Islamist Brotherhood's agenda also in the West by investing in college campuses and sacred democratic institutions and policy centers and think tanks. One of the first think tanks that Qatar invested in was Brookings and Rand, and they opened the door for them to come to Qatar and poured all these resources to allow them to shift public opinion. Since then, Brookings in particular has divested from Qatar, but Qatar was extremely strategic in going and finding needs and seeking to partner up with think tanks all over the United States and Europe and filling in kind of budgetary gaps that these policy spaces couldn't cover, and really using the democratic system in order to erode democracy and to dismantle democratic values from within. And so these are the things that I hope will catch on in Western audiences and Western media, so that we don't miss this opportunity and actually deal with this double-headed snake once and for all, so that the Middle East can have the environment of positive peace that you and I have talked about before, which is obviously the opposite of negative peace. Negative peace is when people call for a ceasefire. They want the absence of violence, right? But it doesn't take into consideration the reasons why that violence erupted in the first place. So it dismisses what we call the context, right? Dismisses all of the building blocks to the extremism and the violence. Now, positive peace means a more long-lasting, sustainable strategy that allows for a shift in cultures, in attitudes, in policy, and that shift can happen slowly so that we can create a foundation for long-lasting peace. And anything short of dismantling and de-radicalizing the extremist organizations that have been causing the chaos leads specifically to a negative peace, not positive peace. And so as someone who has been committed to peace building my whole life, when I woke up on October 7th, I knew this was a decisive moment for me, that either I support very strongly, very publicly, the countering of extremism and explain to the West what they have missed out on in terms of this emboldening, the support for extremism in the East and the West, and specifically the way it manifests in the Red-Green Alliance, or I basically speak to this mythical illusion of peace, which is just impossible to reach with the type of radical extremism that we have to deal with on a daily basis. And that's what I hope people can take away from this war and can understand. I think a lot of people were confused on the wake of October 7th because they didn't understand the Middle East. And I'm not going to blame them because the media hasn't been explaining the Middle East effectively and has been also infiltrated by very strategic Islamists who define the Middle East and represent the Middle East in a very extremist way and oppress and push to the side any voice that tries to represent the Middle East differently in more moderate ways. So I don't blame Western audiences as much, but we've had a year, so I'm hoping that people are understanding things a lot more. And I do have a lot of hope for the next administration.
Thank you for breaking this down. I don't know. I don't have a better term to describe what you just did. Like mic drop, just set the facts, got out of there. I think it's very important what you're saying. And I feel like if I said the same thing as you, I would be viewed as like a crazy conspiracy theorist that surely has to be pulling this out of their ass. Because what you're saying requires the acknowledgement of some inconvenient truths, which the left has refused to accept, which is why we're in this position. The left has a higher tolerance for what you call negative peace than the right, which is why we've seen this like stalemate, neither here nor there Middle Eastern policy. And one might argue even a worsening of our relationship with the Middle East because of 100%. How much bias we now have in our society toward the Middle East and how much of our college campuses are funded by Middle Eastern organizations that have an ulterior motive for our society. So the most important thing I want to underscore about what you said is what you're saying is not counter or exclusionary to progressive values. And the faster that we can accept that and stop resisting the inconvenient truths, the faster we can actually reach peace and a society that we want to participate in so that people don't get beat up in Amsterdam after a soccer game. That's to boil it down to the simplest terms here. Now, of course, let's talk about Israel, right? We've had over a year of this war. Obviously, the war plays a huge dimension in the Middle Eastern climate. Where do you think it's headed? And I have to ask as well, one state or two state solution?
Sure. I definitely want to start by pointing out to a kind of a resource, an article that I wrote for the Jerusalem Post called Dismantling Hamas Requires Arab-Israeli Normalization. And what I mean by that is that, yes, we have to, and Israel has an obligation and a moral duty to dismantle the Islamist threats and the terrorist organizations that are surrounding its borders from the southwest and the north, as well as from multiple fronts that keep shooting rockets and missiles from obviously 7 fronts at the same time and threatening its very own existence. And no country should be dealing with that. No country in the world would be facing those kind of threats and not expected to defend itself and its citizens. And the only reason why we're here is because of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism and Islamist ideology, for sure. Now, the article that I wrote for the Jerusalem Post really goes into the details of what dismantling Hamas means. And part of those details is, how do we create the environment for positive peace? And that environment cannot shift in a better direction, in a more positive direction, without an effective strategy for de-radicalization. Now, knowing Israel as deeply as I do, and the Israeli government in its current manifestation, I am not confident at all that Israel is capable of eradicating that kind of extremism from within. And I'll tell you personal stories about this, walking around not even just Akko and like Arab Israeli towns, but the heart of Tel Aviv and Yafo. I find Islamist banners and posters around the mosques and on the walls of mosques. And I'm usually outraged because those kind of things would never be allowed in moderate Arab states that have developed a very strong de-radicalization policy and strategies. But Israel, in its current manifestation, with ministers who don't even speak Arabic, who are supposed to solve for the security of the citizens in the country, but only see Arabs in this one-dimensional way as just a threat without actually understanding how the threat manifests. They don't even understand these banners and posters that I read in Israel and I'm outraged by and I'm extremely concerned about. This can be a decisive time for Israel to realize that, sure, we will dismantle the military capacities, and that is extremely important. But the next stage is about dismantling the ideology so that 10 years or 5 years from now, we are not back in the same place again. Now, the moderate Arab states in the region have understood this, and they've also understood that you can't militarily defeat this cancer of Islamist radicalism and fundamentalism, and it has to be mitigated and countered with a combination of strategies. And today, the Arab Summit from Saudi Arabia really reiterated this. It did so in a very difficult language, meaning it really came after Israel and the Israeli government. That's going to be completely misunderstood and misinterpreted by the West and even used and weaponized by Islamist organizations and Islamist media like Al Jazeera, right? But what I want people to take away from the language that was uttered today in the summit is that Saudi Arabia, in particular, with its allies, who also was able to gather most of the Arab voices and the Arab states that have a direct stake in this war and in the day after, and to get them united around the same language, to call out Israel and the Israeli government insofar that the extremist members of the government should not be dictating what the day after should look like, but it's also doing so because now that Trump was elected, there's a whole alignment of interests Trump was very beneficial for the moderate Arab states, very effective against Iran and the Muslim Brotherhood. And so there is an understanding in the region today that with the Trump administration stepping in January, the game has changed completely. And the Arab states will go back to having full agency to define what the Middle East will look like with the allyship and the partnership of the United States. Now, because of that, they are putting pressure on Israel to give a certain representation, a certain narrative, and to push a narrative forward that would be more moderate. Because the reality is, now here is the most important thing that people must understand sooner rather than later. The reality is the Palestinian cause has been the bedrock of Islamist fundamentalism in the region. And there is no de-radicalization process that can be sustainable without dismantling this lingering problem and dealing with it in a way that diffuses the tensions in the region. These moderates in the Arab world are saying we are more than willing to push the region forward towards de-radicalization and regional integration and normalization with Israel, and to push for a new age in Middle Eastern civilization with a partnership with the Israelis. But we can't do so at our own expense, at the expense of our own survival, because as much as the Islamists pose an extremely existential risk for Israel's survival, they do the same for these Arab moderate regimes. And so they need the United States as well as Israel to understand that, which is why the tone today was so different from the same summit that took place on November 11th last year, where all day long in the summit last year, they criticized Hamas and the Islamist terrorism that took place on October 7th and that took us away from the possibility and potential of peace. Only a few weeks after Saudi Arabia sent an ambassador to Ramallah, was on the path for normalization. And the language today is, okay, now that we know where we're heading, now that we have the comfort of allyship in the United States in the next administration, we're going to put pressure on Israel. And it's actually fascinating. I've been catching up on the news this morning, but it's fascinating because they're also extending a hand of trust to the Islamic Republic to say, we got your back if you're willing to listen, and we will communicate that we are extending an olive branch to you. And they said in very specific language that Israel should not be allowed to infringe upon Iranian sovereignty. This is the first time that Saudi Arabia says these words in the last 400 days. And they said so because they are trying to shift the balance of power, and to do so with cooperation and diplomacy, and to really, to put it blankly, checkmate Qatar, who has been that de facto mediator for the West, and to take, Saudi Arabia is trying to take its position by mediating or creating an environment for mediation between Iran, Israel, and the United States. It's fascinating. Now, on the issue of either one state or two states will be the solution, it's hard to really tell today. And I can tell you personally, when I'm in Israel, and specifically through kind of the environment of, and I may add, the miraculous environment of the Abraham Accords and all the opportunities it presented, it looked like we were heading towards a one-state solution, even though Saudi Arabia has maintained this rhetoric, this language of saying that we need to see a path towards a two-state solution. And again, that's important for the de-radicalization purposes that we spoke about. When I'm outside of Israel and I'm focused on the international community and the national media and the national expectations, and especially when I'm in the United States, where the majority of the Jewish community has been democratic and on the left and voting left and expecting the same standards of conflict resolution that they're used to elsewhere to work in the Middle East, then I tend to spend a little bit more time in trying to figure out a way to seek a two-state solution. But the reality is, it's going to depend on a lot of factors, which is why this continues to be an extremely difficult question to answer. Factor number one is, how is this normalization process going to look like following Trump stepping into office in January? If it does involve more Palestinians in the process, which historically that didn't really happen, and it didn't happen because they weren't willing to come to the table and to essentially lay down their arms and negotiate in good faith towards a two-state solution. Obviously, Israel has tried to instate a two-state solution many times, and that has been rejected. But the hope lies in Arab states putting certain kind of pressure on the Palestinian Authority to will them, to push them to sit down on the negotiating table. I think that realistically, if we're just trying to think about this pragmatically, Gaza could be a Palestinian state, could become that model. And in fact, Israel tried to do that since 2005. But I think with enough Arab support and interest for normalization and integration and de-radicalization, if we have the Gulf states getting involved in kind of building the day after plan and invested in de-radicalizing Palestinian society from within, then we can have this hope manifest itself in Gaza. Now, the West Bank is a completely different story, obviously. And from my own conversations with Palestinians in Ramallah, in the West Bank, I can tell you that once they realize I speak Arabic, that I'm Moroccan, they take me to the side and they say, to be honest with you, we want to be Israeli citizens. We don't want to be Palestinian citizens because we understand that this environment of corruption and abuse we have been under, and we don't trust that we'll be taken care of in the same way that our Arab Israeli friends or family members or cousins on the other side are benefiting from. So we don't want to miss out on that. We want to have salaries like the average Israeli citizen. Cab drivers will make close to $3,000 a month, when that is nowhere near the reality, not only within the Palestinian territories, but across the Arab world, where the average salary is no more than $250, $300 per month. And so there's this deeper understanding of the kind of economic roadblocks and realities. And I think part of Saudi's strategy to de-escalate and de-radicalize, even within the West Bank, is to push for the Israeli government to release the PA's funds and to allow the PA to pay the salaries that they're owed and to come back into relevance, essentially, because people are economically stifled and don't have many other choices but to join the extremist organizations that kind of buy their souls to sit to and claim that they're going to take care of their families. In that kind of environment, it's really important to come back to reason, pragmatism, realize that it's going to be really hard to find an alternative to the Palestinian Authority, and we can push them to de-radicalize. And I think Saudi has been doing that, even monetarily, even economically, really pressing them to submit to the kind of vision of normalization. But ultimately what happens really lies with the Palestinian leadership. We need courageous Palestinian counterparts to come out of the woodwork and say that this is not helping anyone, and that they are committed and invested in de-radicalizing their society and actually championing the democratic values that they aspire to. And yet there is an infestation of public institutions. There's a level of corruption that is unmatched. So again, we come back to the essence, the thorn in all of this is that truth has not been so common in this issue.
Thank you so much. This has been an excellent learning experience, and I think your criticisms are very fair and valid. How can people connect with you on social media and learn more about your work?
Sure, they can connect with me at Millennial More on Instagram, where I tend to be a little bit more prolific than on Twitter. Twitter is just an unsafe space, so I rarely venture in there. They can also connect with me through email, chamamechtaly@gmail.com, or through the kind of Lazarus form. They can find it on the website. And they can connect with me in person. I often speak at events. I encourage them to stay connected and to follow me on Instagram to find out where I will be. And I would love to meet them if they're interested.
At Sukkot 3000.
That is the best place to be. So next year, Sukkot 3000.
See you
Be
there.
Be square. Exactly.
And last question for you. It's one that I ask every single guest of the podcast. Who would you like to nominate for People Jew Want to Know?
I have a long list. So the first one I want to nominate is Bellamy Bellucci. I don't know if you've spoken to her before, but Bellamy is a South African Black transgender model and ballet teacher, and she has been an extremely outspoken advocate for Israel and for truth. Truth can hurt a lot of people, especially coming from a Black transgender woman. And I think that's specifically why her voice really matters. And she comes from the legacy of apartheid in South Africa. So she, I think, has definitely a lot to say and a lot to share on the topic. And the second person I recommend is Talia Khan, who, like myself, is half Muslim, half Jewish, is a doctorate student at MIT, and has been on the forefront of the fight against campus anti-Semitism and testified to Congress last December on the matter. And I think is one of the people that really embody, for me and many others, that example of leadership in college campuses and how two different identities can come together under American soil.
Thank you so much. Both absolutely fantastic nominations. It's a privilege to have you on, and I can't wait to keep learning from you.
Thank you so much, Margarita. It's a privilege for me to be here, and I'll see you soon.
If you've enjoyed this podcast, please go ahead and rate us 5 stars. Be the first to hear our episodes by subscribing to People Jew Want to Know wherever you get your podcasts. And for exclusive content, follow us on Instagram at People Jew Want to Know.